Pretty much since the very first release of a Sony alpha mirrorless camera, they've all been renowned for overheating when shooting 4K video. Well, today I'm going to show you how to avoid that. So before I'd even got my A7 III, I'd seen videos from other people doing stress tests on 4K video to see how long it would take for the camera to finally overheat. And the results seem to suggest that the A7 III could cope for about 90 minutes before it gave up. By comparison, people were testing it against the A7R III, and the A7R III didn't seem to hit any overheating problems whatsoever. So yesterday I ran my very own stress test of the A7 III to see how long it would take me in this room for the camera to overheat, and then also ran a second test straight after it with my workaround fix. So on the initial test, the camera gave about an hour and 37 minutes before it finally overheated. Now through that test, there were odd minutes here and there where I'd forgot about the 30-minute recording and the camera had ran into standby for a little bit. So obviously during that time, the camera's cooling down slightly. So probably it's more like an hour 30 of solid recording time before this thing finally overheated. So after this had finally overheated, there was a couple of things that I noticed about it. The first was that the battery itself was really quite warm. On a side note, that was at 100% when I started recording the video. 90 minutes of 4K later, it was still just over 50% remaining. So, very impressed with the battery life. The other thing that I noticed was that the back of the camera was obviously very hot. Now, when I pulled the screen away, the screen itself was quite warm, and also behind the screen was extremely hot. So obviously all of that is having an effect on how long the camera can last before it overheats. So in order to improve the recording time, we need to understand how to help the camera stay cool. So let's break this down one step at a time. Firstly, and why I think the A7 III overheats where the A7R III doesn't. Because the A7 III with its 24 meg sensor is actually pulling 6K information off the sensor, and then the processors are downsampling that to 4K, so are putting a lot of strain through the processing unit when recording 4K video. The A7R III by comparison doesn't. If you're shooting full frame 4K, it pixel bins a lot of the information because it has such a high resolution sensor. So the processors don't go through anywhere near as much strain as these do. Now the processor in this camera is situated right behind the sensor on the main circuit board, and the main circuit board is right here behind this screen. Now the screen itself, much like your phone or your TV or anything like that, when it's on for a long period of time producing light, it also produces heat. So if the screen's up to the body, not only is that generating heat that's seeping into the camera body itself, but also it's basically acting like another layer to the camera and stopping the heat from the processor being dissipated off the back of the body. So step number one for improving the cooling is to pull the screen away from the camera body. This means two things. One, the heat from the screen isn't going to affect the camera body itself, but also means there's less insulation stopping the heat from escaping, and when it finally does escape, it's got a channel to be able to just get away from the camera body. Step number two, the battery. Lithium-ion batteries generate heat when they discharge. So obviously, if you're recording using the battery as power source, then it's going to generate more heat within inside the camera. Now, a lot of that heat is going to be able to escape through the sides of the camera here, but some of it is naturally going to seep over towards where the processors are, which is just going to heat the camera up even more. So for the second stress test, I powered the camera using the official Sony charger that came with the camera. Now that meant that the camera was actually plugged into the mains for this. I also angled the screen away in order to give the camera a bit more room to breathe. So first stress test, camera ran for 90 minutes and then overheated. On the second run, it got to more than 3.5 hours until I just ran out of time and had to stop it. But the camera didn't actually overheat, which means it could probably go on for quite a bit longer. Couple of points I will mention. Firstly, it wouldn't have gone on forever. When I started that second stress test, the battery was up to 88%. By the time it had finished 3.5 hours later, it had dropped to 45%. So over that 3.5 hours, it had managed to drop 40% of its battery life, which means that the camera is pulling more power than what it is receiving from the mains charger. Now, The transformer on the mains charger states that it outputs 1.5 amps. A lot of USB power supplies only actually give you 1 amp. A lot will state 2, 3, 4 amp outputs, but generally most of those won't actually give you more than 1 amp unless the device you are using can communicate with it and tell it that it can accept more than 1 amp, which Sony cameras won't tell a charger unless it's an official Sony charger that it can take more than a single amp. So if you are using an external power supply, odds are the battery drain is going to be even faster than what I experienced yesterday. Realistically though, 1 amp charging versus 1.5 amp charging would probably equate to about 60-65% battery drain rather than the 40 that I experienced, which would probably correlate to being able to get about 4.5-5 hours of recording from a fully charged battery before the camera went flat, which is probably going to be more than sufficient for most of you out there. But do bear in mind, I live in the UK, so it's not exactly warm over here. If you live in a much hotter climate or you're outside on sunny days, then obviously the ambient air temperature is going to be a lot warmer, so the camera is probably going to overheat eventually, but using these techniques should at least manage to kind of prolong the amount of time that you can record for. Hope this has helped some of you guys out there. If you have any questions, queries, anything at all, comment box is down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and as always, hopefully, I'll see you in the next video.